Welcome to Employee Termination Tips. My name is Christopher Neufeld of Neufeld Legal. And in this particular video, we're going to discuss the first thing that should be requested by an Alberta employee who's been fired or otherwise terminated from their job. And that first thing that they should be doing, consistent with everything else they're planning to do, is to request their Section 14.5 employee statement pursuant to the Alberta Employment Standards Code. And what is a 14.5 statement? Well, let's go specifically to what it says in the statute. And that is, on request, an employer must give to an employee, which includes a former employee, a detailed statement of how the employee's earnings were calculated and the method of calculating any bonus or living allowance paid, whether or not it forms part of wages. So the first critical thing, and we already mentioned it, is that it is not only employees, but the definition of employees in Section 1 includes former employees. So even though you've been fired, terminated, even quit your job, you can still request this document. And when you request it, your former employer now has a mandatory obligation to provide it to you. It says must give. There's no optionality in the statute. It's required to be provided to you. The only problem that you might run into is that the employer might defer, delay, and jeopardize the timelines that it's set out for you to accept their termination and severance pay package. In those cases, you really should be talking to a lawyer, getting some guidance on this, because you don't necessarily want to let these deadlines slip. But at the same time, there's a positive obligation upon the employer to provide this to you, because in many respects, as you'll see, it's very important to understanding what exactly you are entitled to and whether or not your former employer is paying you and has paid you all that you are owed. So what is the critical things that you'll have to see in this statement that has to be provided by your former employer? A detailed statement of the calculations of all earnings, how they calculate them. And what are earnings? Well, there's wages. And you got to remember, you got to look once again to the definition of wages in Section 1 of the Employment Standards Code of Alberta to find out what is included in wages. You want a statement explain the calculation of wages, not simply salary, not simply hourly pay, but wages. Also, to provide you with how they calculate overtime pay, how they calculate vacation pay, how they calculate general holiday pay, otherwise known as statutory holiday pay, and also how they calculate termination pay. All these aspects must be shown to you as to how they've calculated them for yourself. It's a statutory obligation. Also, should you be receiving a bonus, they have to set out the methodology for how they determine the bonuses. And this is important because it refers back to what wages are and refers back to, in turn, what all the other payments are and how they are applied. Because certain bonuses are included in wages and certain other bonuses are not included in wages. But when you look at the definition, most bonuses are included in wages. They're very few and far between that they're not. And that's a critical aspect that you have to remember. Now, what you'll find oftentimes, and this is a problem with so many, even of the larger employers, is that they're reliant upon non-Alberta payroll software, non-Alberta payroll systems to determine payroll. And because of that, their calculations are all too often inconsistent with the law is. And this is how you gain leverage, and this is how you collect all that you are deserved. Because what they have to be doing is they have to be showing stuff that is consistent with the law. And when you look at your pay statements, They have to reflect the same basis as what is in this statement that's being offered up to you. And then it must be consistent with what the Alberta Employment Standards Code says. All three have to match up. You cannot have deviations, because when you have deviations, almost always it results in underpayments, and that's not permitted by law. And if you don't understand it, what you need to do is immediately take this information to a lawyer who understands these aspects. Because if you get the information and there's inconsistencies in there, you have a legal right to get your money. You can't be making up stuff. And that goes for your former boss and employer in particular. You can't simply defer to whatever the software says, whatever calculations you think are more amenable, practical. That's not how the law works. That's not how employees in Alberta are paid during the course of their employment and upon termination. So really, the first thing you need to be asking for early on, almost immediately after you watch this video, is to ask your former boss or the person who provides you the termination package to provide you with your 14.5 statement in accordance with the Alberta Employment Standards Code, so that you can make a proper assessment as to where you stand relative to your termination. Because if they're not going to provide it to you, what are they doing? It's statutory obligation to provide it to you. It's probably because they don't want to disclose information that's critical to your position, and they're attempting to hide that information from you. They might not know how to do it, but that's what they have lawyers for. And if the lawyers don't know how to prepare it or don't want to prepare it, that is problematic for your former employer, and you need to deal with it practically. So, first thing first, take the opportunity. You've lost your job. You're legally entitled to this. Simply make the request. Say you want your section 14.5 statement with respect to earnings calculations and bonus methodology, and see where it takes you. And if it takes you where oftentimes I think it will, you're going to need to talk to a lawyer and find out how to address those underpayments or non-payments that you are legally entitled to. Thank you.